Okay, it's David Holmgren here, speaking to the Solar Punk Society, and in spite of it, looks like it probably says Michael Wells on the screen. And when I was asked to speak about the connection between permaculture and solar punk, I had to look up Wikipedia to at least confirm my expectation that it's being a future-focused arts and literary movement with links from the more retro-focused steampunk. So that was sort of my initial understanding. In this introduction to permaculture, I'll discuss the crossovers with solar punk as I understand them, and then draw on permaculture publications and other creative media to draw out some themes that might stimulate questions and discussion. And hopefully the slides I've prepared will further illuminate my thinking on the subject. So let me go to those slides and sharing, hopefully, so you can see that and navigate around the platform. Okay. So, yeah, the role of permaculture in a solar punk future was what I was asked to speak to. So I will address that and really first, I suppose, look at what is permaculture. And just working out how to use this platform. But yeah, I suppose for many people, permaculture is a cool form of organic gardening, and it's certainly about food and farming and working with nature in many different ways. It's about energy and materials, and it's about ourselves and community. But I like to explain permaculture as being a design system for regenerative and resilient land use and living. And it's based on universal ethics and design principles, even though the strategies and techniques will vary enormously with the context. It's also a grassroots and international movement of practitioners, designers, and organisations. And I think for many people, it's an empowering response to environmental, economic, and social crisis. It's been crafted over nearly half a century now by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of practitioners, designers, teachers, and activists worldwide, but originating in Australia. And some claim it as Australia's greatest intellectual export. Permaculture design can be applied to most areas of life and work, even if for most people it begins in the garden. And the permaculture flower organises the scope of permaculture action in 7 domains. Now, at the household level, we simplify the 7 domains to 3 fields of action: the built, the biological, and the behavioural. And in the suburban context, those 3 fields still make retro suburbia a whopping 600-page manual. So permaculture covers a lot of territory. You could say the scope of permaculture then is as broad as the vision for a solar punk future, which of course, if we're talking about the future, we need to sort of consider everything. Even if the expressions of both are often understood in iconic symbolic examples or even tags. So beyond the wide scope of both permaculture and solar punk, there are other similarities. The idea that current practice can model a more benign future. This focus on creating a better future is a strong crossover. However, the lineage and bias of permaculture has been primarily pragmatic, utilitarian, functional, some would say even an anti-aesthetic pragmatism. While I understand solar punk to be more symbolic, aesthetic, artistic. So this is a subject I could discuss more if there's specific interest. However, the permaculture vision of the future is strongly influenced by the limits to growth concept and human futures characterized by energy descent. As a result, permaculture includes a deep respect for nature's design rules, the ways of living of Indigenous and traditional cultures of place, and down-to-earth practices of our forebears. So, having used this slide over the last decade in presentations to show how available energy is the fundamental driver of both growth and decline of human economies and cultures throughout history, and then to consider 4 possible futures that, short of a second coming of Christ, all human futures must sort of roughly fit into this pattern. While permaculture is designed to be resilient in energy descent futures, I get the impression most solar punk visions are more based on assumptions of some form of what I call techno-stability, if not techno-explosion, that gives us greater control over our destiny, greater control over nature. For those seriously interested in futures, they can check out our futurescenarios.org website, or for a more current and cool explanation, I can recommend Nat Hagen's The Great Simplification. So energy descent futures might involve novel responses and solutions not available to our ancestors. I just love this image from a children's book of the 1980s by Graham Oakley. Well worth checking that out too, if you can find a copy of it. So this retro aspect of permaculture is highlighted in retro suburbia, and especially the Aussie street story, charting the real lived history and potential retrofitted future of suburbia and suburban living. In this form, permaculture could be better aligned with steampunk, looking to simpler technology and lifeways as inspiration, rather than high-tech and novel lifeways that may not survive beyond this unsustainable moment of a civilization already deep into overshoot. In this way, permaculture productivity generally relies more on nature's abundance and democratic and simple technology combined with voluntary simplicity and a creative adaptations to circumstances to craft a more benign human future. So The use of the term retro in retro suburbia is quite deliberate, of firstly meaning retrofitting to make fit for new purpose. And around the idea that we'll face very, very different futures with the built infrastructure and the lived habitats and all of the stuff from effectively a failing technological civilization in some form or another. We will have to retrofit that. But it also indicates retro in the sense of that harking back or a positive view of some things in the past that we might be able to reclaim and reorganize. To get grounded in real examples of permaculture design productivity relevant to urban contexts, we can do no better than look at the Plummery in suburban Melbourne, a featured case study in retro suburbia. Despite the limitations of space, soil contamination, and pest animals, this permaculture design system that includes quail and bees feeds the household the majority of its fresh food needs while generating a surplus for barter. Kat Lavers runs sustainable gardening programs in local government and walks her talk at home a few hours a week to produce half a tonne of food from 100 square metres using permaculture design and organic methods of soil, plant and animal husbandry. The table is from retro suburbia, but the figures in red are more up-to-date data than what we published in the book. Kat weighs everything she harvests from the garden. That probably takes a significant amount of extra work from my experience. But that understanding the actual productive potential of garden agriculture is part of what permaculture practitioners and designers are enabling, because we don't really know what is possible. So here's some more up-to-date photos in winter and spring. Note the passive solar retrofit, and in summer. But this permaculture abundance doesn't happen without some hard choices. At the Plummery, possums, which are very common in suburban landscapes in Melbourne, did enormous damage to this garden, and that it wasn't able to be stopped by simple tree nets. There's now a fence-top electric fence unit designed for suburban gardens to exclude possums that would otherwise make food production impossible. At Abdullah House, another retro suburbia case study, the backyard abundance, passive solar design of the building, rooftop solar power and hot water would not have been possible without removing one huge eucalypt tree that dominated the small block. In taking down this large red gum, the timber, wood, sawdust, bark and foliage were all used or recycled in either the building or the landscaping. So creative and respectful reuse is often the best option, especially in the leafy suburbs, towns and rural areas where large trees, especially evergreen trees in a cool temperate climate, and the wildlife that live in them can prevent food production, right where we have the most capacity to make a difference. So this also brings up another two ways in which permaculture reconnects us to our ancestors. Rather than being more and more confined to the bubble of the technosphere, permaculture living is more outdoors much of the year in most Australian climates. This strengthens connection to nature, reduces the hold of media technologies on children and perhaps the rest of us too, and reduces the sense of crowding. Now, COVID has highlighted how much safer and healthier it is to be outdoors, even ignoring the benefits of vitamin D from exposure to sunlight, which is a proven protective and recovery factor in respiratory diseases generally and COVID specifically. Babies and children playing in the dirt is good for boosting natural immunity, unlike experimental therapeutics peddled by convicted criminal pharmaceutical corporations and mandated by corrupt state regulators. So, cooking with wood also rekindles our ancestral relationship to fire. It reduces dependence on centralized and high-tech energy. It can be carbon neutral and done in ways that are very fuel efficient with minimal smoke. Wood is stored solar energy that doesn't contribute to global corporations' efforts to enclose the last great commons of sunlight. That energy density, for people who can relate it to electricity, is about 4.6 kilowatt hours per kilo of wood. Congealed sunlight, we think of it as. So the central focus in that community gathering at Trio in Daylesford is a very simple outdoor cooking stove made from an olive oil drum. It is even simpler and quicker to construct than a rocket stove and is almost as fuel efficient and smokeless, burning stick fuel. The current geopolitical conflicts cover the reality of peak oil and resource depletion more generally, but do highlight for many the importance of energy as well as food self-reliance at the household, community, bioregional and national levels. The current environmental orthodoxy promoting high-tech energy solutions while ignoring low-tech and indigenous sources of energy is bad policy based on ideology and a narrow view of the science. We should be planning in most places, not all places on the planet, but many places, especially in the affluent world, to use more wood in our buildings and for energy in ways that are good for our forests, good for wildfire safety, and a more resilient future. To understand more about the permaculture vision for use of wood energy, people can read my Bushfire Resilient Land and Climate Care at the Holmgren Design website. Now, such simple, down-to-earth strategies encapsulated in retro suburbia may seem a bit pedestrian, especially for many young folk wanting vision and answers to allow humanity to navigate the manifold aspects of the global crisis. Even worse for some, it could seem like just more socially conservative prepping for hard times ahead based on tinfoil hat conspiracy theories. So we've deliberately crafted retro suburbia to appeal to householders concerned about their future and wanting to live a better life now. It is an inclusive framework that doesn't even require a belief in climate change to be useful and attractive. But it also flags lifeways that are not tied to place and certainly don't depend on ownership. Permaculture can comfortably support different lifeways, stages of life, and beliefs. If the Holmgren take on reality is a little challenging for some, then permaculture teacher and elder Rosemary Morrow might be just the ticket. Her newly released Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture throws a different light on the subject with hundreds of very simple line drawings and a bit more of a textbook feel. It's informed by her tireless work all over the world, including in some of the toughest war zones and refugee camps. The foreword is by Indian ecofeminist Vandana Shiva, and the book is endorsed by the UN as a contribution to the Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, 2021 to 2030. For those yearning for a vision of how permaculture might apply anywhere in the world, and especially in cities where an increasing proportion of the world's people now live, then this guide might be the one must-have permaculture text. Of course, some tinfoil hatters might be holding up their crosses because the UN is the mark of the devil. Oh, but Vandana Shiva is a long-time critic of the pharmaceutical industry. It's such a confusing world. And if that doesn't float your boat, then there are thousands of other expressions of permaculture, including artistic and musical ones, that all contribute to a better world. From the permaculture calendar that drip feeds the 12 design principles into consciousness throughout the year, to 470, a ripping story of a wild and tough near future, but with an empowering sense of how we can navigate the climate emergency, to Formidable Vegetable, electro swing music that normalizes new ways of being and doing for the next generation. So through these and other examples, permaculture includes aesthetic and artistic juice to enliven design science and grounded practice that can in turn provide our material needs and sustenance. So rather than finding a role for permaculture in the solar punk future, dare I say that the question to answer is, how can the youthful solar punk movement contribute its creativity and energy to the deep and diverse lineage of permaculture activism, helping to create the world we want by living it each day? We can get our own house in order and recreate the global commons for all, rather than dreaming of techno-salvation delivered by global corporations in their desperate efforts to enclose even the ultimate common of sunlight. And yes, I didn't fess up that we here at Meliadora are heathen sun worshippers. So that's likely to upset someone, but you can't please everyone all the time. Such is life for any storyteller, artist, or musician. The Retro Suburbia book is accessible online on a pay what you feel basis from retrosuburbia.com. Something that was a response to the lockdowns of COVID to provide this for people who really needed it. But to get the real 600-page 1-kilo manual and or Earth Restorer's Guide, both are now available from Permaculture Principles in the USA. So help create the world we all want by supporting independent publishing, distributing and retailing as we boycott the online information supermarkets with a fair share for all. And I wanted to end with this photo of me and Ro in our greenhouse here at home as, permaculture old farts, hopefully contributing something inspiring and useful to younger people who might be crafting the next stage in the exciting journey to taking back control of our own lives and contributing to a better future. Okay. Okay. So that's the presentation I've got. I might just go back to and leave that one there. And yeah, so if there's any comments or questions, I'm happy to answer those, and whether they're of technical or practical nature or philosophical. Happy to answer things there. I'll just have to see where am I seeing what people say. Yep. So a question there, can you speak about your early experiences with permaculture? What do you wish you knew starting out? Well, I suppose because permaculture was something that emerged between myself and Bill Mollison when he was my informal mentor, even though he was an academic at a university and I was a student at a university, actually at different institutions. And he was teaching in the psychology faculty, but I was interested in him as an ecologist, not because he had a label as an ecologist, but because I recognized his thinking as ecological. And so in that process of working closely together and sharing house and creating first prototype permaculture garden, he had the big vision that we should call this something, because we couldn't see in published literature or other sources something that was as holistic as what we were talking about. In fact, I suppose I progressively started to understand that there was a lot of thinking, similar thinking, developing independently of us in the 70s. And that was building on earlier waves of what you might call sustainability thinking that were happening in affluent Western societies like the United States and Australia and Europe, and also actually in Japan back in the 1930s. And also earlier waves of recognizing the problems of the industrial society back in the late 19th century. So permaculture was definitely building on those things. But for me, when I met Bill Mollison and the circle of people he was in, it was so exciting to meet people who, if they couldn't do something themselves, they knew other people who could. Everything from gardening to building a house to, in fact, designing an ocean-going trading boat that a mate of Bill's was building in a paddock next to his property. So for someone who was always keen to work with my hands and do things, but came from a family that wasn't super practical, as we would say in those years, that was a huge excitement. So my parents were political radicals and, taught me how to think for myself and a huge amount of things of value. But if something went wrong with the plumbing in our house as a child, they rang up a plumber. Whereas when I met Mollison in this circle of people in Tasmania, they seemed to do everything for themselves. So that was incredibly important for me. And I think I could say that, I missed out as a child as osmotically absorbing all of the skills of self-reliance. I had to learn them as a young adult. But whether I see that as a disadvantage, there's definitely an element of that to have the experience of our son Oliver, who's now 36 and has a level of integration of the practical and the biological world, which in many ways is much superior to mine because he grew up in it from being a baby. But there's also an element of, being allowed to occupy territory that your parents don't know things about. And Oliver did that as a young age too. In the workshop, by age 14, he was a better welder than I was. I'm primarily a woodworker. And so he sort of occupied that domain and is a complete tech head and serious self-taught engineer, one might say. So I think I don't really have any regrets about what I wish I knew when I was starting out. I mean, there's certainly mistakes that I've made along the way, and certainly with Meliodora here, there was a major mistake with at one stage overusing the wrong mineral amendments on the property, using too much dolomite lime and creating bad imbalances in the soil, which have taken a long time to correct. And you could say that was a little bit of knowledge that was, in that particular case, dangerous. And before soil tests were available at a reasonable cost in the 90s. So I suppose I could say that it would be my largest regret in the development of Meliodora over the last 30 years, that when I came here, I had a huge amount of knowledge about certain areas, but some of my understandings about soil mineral balance were a bit vague, and I was acting without the appropriate information. And some of that is actually documented in Retro Suburbia and sort of explaining that as a cautionary tale, with that mystery of how we build and maintain soil fertility, which is still the biggest issue. And sometimes people in permaculture downplay how complex that can be, and how fertility can also be a transitory thing where we can get fantastic results for a few years and then things sort of move off that sort of peak abundance and health. And sometimes it's hard to know how to get that back. So all of those issues, especially when we garden repeatedly on the same site, producing mineral-dense human food, that's enormously demanding of the soil. That's a bit of a rambling answer, but hopefully that addresses that question. So if we've got any other questions, it's hard to know where people who might be watching this are coming from, both in where they are physically, but where they are in, as I was saying with that graphic, that stage of life, which really means that different things are relevant to different people. Just pulling that back up from retro suburbia, this household form and location, and I've highlighted the lower quadrant there, mobile minimalism to maintain options, because this is the one that's often really relevant to young people who are sort of casting out, working what they're going to do, getting a lot of experiences. But these four sort of life ways are really a product of two tensions. The first on the horizontal axis is of whether we should consolidate in a place we know or near a territory we know with all the benefits of that knowledge, or whether we should migrate to somewhere else with better prospects, or to move away from bad stuff that might be happening. So that's a tension there. And obviously, when you think of young people emerging out of their parental nest, there's a huge incentive, or there certainly was in my generation, to migrate somewhere else, to move somewhere else. But also these days, a great difficulty in doing that, with a lot more young people at home in multi-generational households. And the second tension is between how much we can develop and control a territory, a household, a property, make the world as we want it, and how much we need to downshift and disown, simplify, adapt to what we find. And so that really creates those four spaces. And interestingly, while I mentioned the mobile minimalism might apply to people of any age, it most classically is something that young people take up. And then this communal living space is sort of more, whether it's a formal eco-village or shared ownership of a property or something, it's where there's a lot greater capacity to do things because of the communal nature. And it often involves going somewhere new, at least for most of the people, and some sort of equal contribution and power in that dynamic. And it's often part of a vision of, we're going to do things differently, we're going to make the world. And then the third space, which we call family castle. And if anyone's seen the Australian film The Castle, it is actually partially a reference to that. This is the sort of classic retro suburbia template, often an extended multi-generation family household. But it might be also just people getting children, saying, okay, where are we going to settle down, get the basics happening, and anchor down for the long haul. And then there's a natural drift down to this last one with aging, adapt in situ to age with grace. And what's interesting about this is these two upper ones, family castle and communal living, often have the capacity and the need for volunteers, people coming temporarily. And the mobile minimalists might actually be the people who come and join those places. And that those two also have the social and economic capacity to support sometimes lone older people in their community. And so these four really constitute a sort of like an ecosystem. So in that sense, although retrosuburbia is very household focused rather than community focused, a lot of permaculture has been very community focused or individual focused. The individual activist experimenter, that was the sort of like the first phase of permaculture in a lot of ways. The radical individualist, sometimes with a family in tow. And then the second phase was more characterized by things like the transition towns movement that came out of Britain with Rob Hopkins, focused on how do we, in communities, often existing communities, adapt ourselves for challenging futures. And that very sort of community-oriented approach. And not everyone actually sort of really relates to that. And often you get this thing, the individual and the community, and forgetting that we all live in a household. Now, at that simplest level, it's just a one-person household, and that's actually not really very sustainable. So we do need our households to be bigger, and I'm a great advocate of the household level strategies of building that capacity. Okay, advice on urban food forest builders. Well, if you look in the chapter on perennial food systems and trees in the biological section of retrosuburbia, you'll see there that I look at the role of trees in smaller urban spaces as between three templates. One that I call edible forest gardens or food forests, which is sort of like high density plantings on the classic subtropical, tropical food forest model. And then the other one, the more traditional one that I call backyard orchards, which is sort of wide space in a cool climate, mostly deciduous fruit and nut trees with space underneath where kids can play and also climb in the trees. And then a third one called intensive food gardens that involve a spalliate crops for maximum productivity. And that's what you see at the fringes of Cat Laver's place. Because this balance between production of actual edible food and woody and leafy biomass is something that needs to be managed the less space there is available, and the more that space needs to perform other functions like children's play space. Whereas a food forest model is a higher density one, which can work in cool climates, but I tend to be a little bit more skeptical about the way a lot of people see that model applying everywhere in all situations. So check out the online retrosuburbia manual on that, because that's sort of my distilled experience over the decades to sort of calibrate what is the place of those systems and how can they contribute. Hopefully that helps on that, because yeah, there's a huge interest in food forests that historically have been a very well-established food system in subtropical and tropical areas, but the adaptation into drier climates and cool temperate climates is possible, but is a little more complex, and there's more limitations. For example, a lot of our deciduous fruit trees, especially the stone fruit, but even many of the others, they only bear fruit where the canopy is exposed to the sun. whereas a lot of the subtropicals like macadamia, avocado, white sapote, feijoas, and guavas, the trees will bear fruit inside the canopy and are used to a much higher level of shade and also humidity and are resistant to fungal diseases. So there's that effect of having space between things, which is beneficial for a lot of those cool climate things. There's a sort of basic principle. If you've got unlimited water and constant warmth and sunlight, then you can stack a lot of things together. Okay, I think we're time is getting close to the end, but if there was one more question and I was reasonably brief in my answer, we could manage that as well. Okay, well, we'll finish up the session there, and hopefully that's will be available for other people, and we'll definitely hope to promote that also through the Holmgren and the Retro Suburbia website, and we'd certainly encourage people to support independent publishing and distribution, so we can, in the same way that we encourage people to, through community-supported agriculture, to support farmers directly and basically completely boycott the supermarkets. Don't have anything to do with them, whether they're the information supermarkets or the food supermarkets. We've never been near those places, certainly when we're home-based, at least. And the folks on that bicycle, actually, Artistus Family, provide fantastic resources and insights into all of these ways as well. And that photo was taken from their epic trip in a book, The Art of Free Travel, in which they avoided the supermarkets completely as well. So thanks for that, and we'll see you in the soup, as we say. Okay, so we'll end the broadcast there.